Welcome to All Things Green. I'm Shelby, here with my sunny co-host Anton to discuss a variety of topics from across the sustainability universe. Anton, I think I know you're sunny today, but how else are you?
Just sunny.
You kind of match my sunny book that I brought in today.
It's a cool looking cover. What's it about?
Yeah, so this is a book called All We Can Save: Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis. And the editors are Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson and Catherine K. Wilkinson.
Okay.
You ever heard of this book?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's been pretty popular. It was published a few years ago. This was given to me as a gift by my dear friend Zainab. She read it. She's also really interested in the environment, and so she passed it along to me. And I loved that it was about climate change, but also from this really positive perspective. It's a very hopeful book, while still encouraging urgency around these issues. And it's also all written by women. So it's this collection of essays, poetry, and even art that's by women about the climate change movement and about climate change as a science. So I'm not totally done with it yet, so I can't give my full recommendation, but I wanted to bring it up partially to talk about ways that we can engage in climate change conversations, because I follow my local park system, like I get their emails, and they are actually having a conversation about this book that was
so cool.
Free to register for. So my friend and I are actually going to go talk about this book together with other locals who just want to reflect on our ever-changing world through the lens of a book. And so I wanted to bring it up both as a recommendation, something that people could read if they are interested in learning a little more, but also as a way to think about how we can engage in these conversations in our communities.
Very important. I'm so glad that you brought that up today.
Yeah, and plus, again, I think it's a perfect match for your look. Oh yeah, the blue eyes, the yellow t-shirt, it's all you.
And the square, rectangle shape.
Absolutely. That's just like you. So I just wanted to bring in a book that maybe we could touch base on in the future. I'm only about 50 pages in.
Yeah,
so
I'm 51 pages in.
51 pages. You're always just one step ahead of me. So right now I'm not going to bring any particular references from the book to our conversation, but I absolutely plan to in the future. And I wanted everyone to know where it was coming from.
Yeah, after we both finish the book, then we'll definitely touch base and discuss it in the podcast.
Absolutely, since you're 51 pages in.
Yes.
I also think this is a little bit of a good segue into talking about our episode today. So we realize this is episode 30, which feels pretty wild.
That's a milestone.
It's a milestone. And also, we've been talking so much about topics related to climate change that we haven't really stepped back to the beginning and defined what we mean when we say climate change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People that are like so involved in the fight, I think sometimes we even just take it for granted, like the science that's backing it all. So
absolutely.
I don't know.
And history. So whether you have been working on climate science or climate change work for decades, or you're getting to know it, we wanted to take a step back, talk about sort of the timeline of climate science, and then also some of the key statistics that are driving the urgency of the movement today. How does it sound to you?
Sounds amazing, Shelby.
All right. So normally we kind of go back and forth with 3 segments, but today we're going to have 2 longer ones.
Yeah.
I'm going to start by talking about that timeline, and then you're going to take it away with a little bit of data. And this book kind of spurred that for me because they had a section at the beginning talking about one of the earliest climate scientists, and it made me realize I'd never heard of her, and I wanted to make sure I could reference her. So let's get started on this timeline.
Let's get started, Shelby.
Okay, wonderful. So here is a brief history of climate science research, and I want to credit out loud the source I used for this. There were several, but particularly the timeline that I used. It's from the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research, which is a nonprofit consortium of 120 plus North American colleges and universities that are focused on research and training in the Earth science system. And they did a great job of making it really easy to go through a timeline, and there were all sorts of other references. So we'll leave it in the show notes, and I really encourage anyone who likes this segment and wants to dive a little deeper to go use all of their little training modules to learn more about what happened during each of these timelines and things that are happening now. So
sounds good,
let's start at what I'm going to consider the beginning. In 1640, a scientist named Johann Baptista von Helmont
Okay.
Blanket statement at the beginning that
Cool
these names were a challenge for me. I looked up as many as I could, but I might not pronounce them all correctly.
Yeah. I think I'm going to name my child that.
Johann Baptista von Humboldt.
Yeah.
Great. Hopefully I said it correctly. So it's 1640 and Johann discovers carbon dioxide.
Okay.
And he refers to it as the spirit of wood because he learns about it in terms of trees. Mm-hmm. Let's skip forward over 100 years. It's been more than 100 years since we discovered what carbon dioxide is. It's now 1760 and the Industrial Revolution is kicking off. It begins and carbon dioxide emissions begin to rev up. So we really think in the kind of climate change world that the Industrial Revolution is when we moved away from natural rhythms of global warming and cooling to human-powered global warming that was overtaking these natural rhythms. So that's around 1760. And now, again, we're moving forward in time. It's 1856. Here's the woman I learned about in the book All We Can Save. Her name was Eunice Foote. And she was doing some experiments that showed that carbon dioxide and water vapor would cause air to warm up when it was exposed to sunlight. She even presented this research at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. I'm curious, because you're interested in climate change, obviously. Have you heard about Eunice Foote?
I have not.
Yeah, she was news to me too.
Was her research well received when she presented it?
It seems as if it was, and yet she doesn't get a whole lot of credit.
Right,
of
that's
course,
wild.
I fully recognize that I am not a trained climate scientist, so maybe people who went to school for that specifically have more exposure to some of this history. But when I think about science, climate science, I think more about modern day.
Yeah.
And then when I go back, I'm thinking more about like John Tyndall. His name stuck out to me, but I'd never heard of Eunice Foote.
Well, I mean, screw Eli Whitney and the cotton gin. We should be learning about like Eunice Foote and like
absolutely
people like that, you know?
Yeah, she compared what it would look like to look at air that had carbon dioxide and water vapor in it compared to like less carbon dioxide, and realized that yes, it got hotter a lot faster. And then a few years later, 3 years later to be exact, in 1859, John Tyndall, who I had heard about, found that nitrogen and oxygen could not trap heat. It didn't have the ability to trap heat, but carbon dioxide, ozone, and water vapor could. So John Tyndall is often given the credit of work that kind of stemmed from Eunice Foote's work. Cruising forward, we're getting faster. People are thinking about this more. It's been 100 years since the Industrial Revolution. You're noticing smog. You're noticing changes in the environment. You're noticing pollution. Climate science is revving up. So Svante Arrhenius, I told you, warnings about the names, discovers that burning coal produces carbon dioxide, warms the climate, and he thought that sounded just lovely.
What part of the world is he from? He's like, I'm sick of these winters or something.
He I want to say he was Flemish, but I read about a lot of scientists and I didn't write down all their nationalities here. So double check me, but definitely from a more Northern European part of the world. And he said, wow.
Bring it on.
Yes, literally there were quotes from his journals in the science or in the research I was reading where he was saying like, wow, future generations are going to have just lovely weather. This is going to be great. So listen, he wasn't a climate denier. He was just climate excited. But he was not the last person to discuss this. I'm also not the first to say, hey, love this new weather. But in 1958, we really started to see this becoming part of a more national and international conversation. Bell Telephone Science Hour actually ended up broadcasting climate science on TV, sort of to the masses. Anyone who had a TV in 1958, when you only had a couple channels, was probably seeing this. And they attributed planetary warming to humans. And they also, in 1958, we saw Charles Keeling, a scientist, taking daily carbon dioxide measurements in Hawaii. So we started seeing some of the first regular measurements of carbon dioxide taken in real time, instead of having to use like post-dating measures. So by 1958, it's kind of part of the conversation. People who are watching TV are seeing this. And by 1988, 30 years later, NASA scientist James Hansen testified in front of Congress about human-caused global warming, warning us about imminent demise, essentially, and all the ways that this could affect our climate. I also wanted to take just a moment to talk about the way that media has covered climate change, because we've covered 1960 to 1988, and the only time we've talked about media here so far was when Bell Technologies was talking about it on TV. But you and I grew up in a time when climate change was definitely on the news. How do you remember climate change or global warming, probably more likely, being discussed on the news, like in your house growing up?
Yeah, my family wasn't like a big political thing, but it was kind of like whenever I brought up climate change, because I would learn about it in school, my parents were like, yeah, maybe there'll be some new like things that they figure out to solve climate change, but there was never like urgency. There wasn't even that much controversy like I see now in my household. So I don't know if that helps you, but
Yeah. Well, it's interesting even that right at the beginning of that you said, oh, my family wasn't very political.
yeah,
Because, whoa, I mean, that's telling right there
Yeah.
that we've looked at this science that goes back to 1640 that's building up to this, and that by the time you were growing up in the early 2000s, it
Yeah.
was politicized.
it was politicized. Yeah,
So you're saying, oh, I didn't learn about that at home or talk about it at home because
Yeah.
we didn't want to be political, rather than, oh, we just didn't know, we weren't
Right.
informed.
I think you're absolutely right. And it's kind of interesting that you say like just a couple of channels, the Bell, whatever, they would broadcast like probably these science and these facts. And it's just probably not really recognizable, decades later, between Fox and like CNN, MSNBC.
Yes, there's definitely
A
more.
divergence of,
People can kind of slot themselves into watching the sort
Right.
of media that resonates with them
Right.
versus, okay, there's only 3 channels, so this is like the news that we're all getting and interpreting on our own,
Yeah.
but we're all seeing the same things. So when I was growing up, definitely I saw global warming on the news, and my family too only really watched one kind of media, so I only got one story about climate change or global warming. But I remember a lot of the media that I saw, or even what I was learning in school, trying to give both sides, essentially saying, we've talked about this before, oh yeah, it seems like the world is warming, we have science that shows it's warming, but was it really humans, and what are the pros of the fossil fuels that are creating this warming? And so last November, I went to the American Public Health Association conference. Great conference for any of us public health nerds. And I actually went to a session where a scientist was talking about the ways that media portrayed climate change with this showing both sides perspective and how damaging it was to public perceptions of factual climate science that, as we can see, has been building for centuries.
Yes.
And so that has shifted. More of the mainstream media is talking about climate science from a factual basis now. Certainly not all. But now we're doing it with other things. And some of those are relevant to climate change. So things that this particular scientist studied were food waste and plant-based diets. So she saw similar trends around those two topics of trying to show both sides. So we know that plant-based diets are scientifically really healthy for us, and they produce fewer carbon emissions to engage in than really meat-heavy diets. But right now, a lot of media is trying to cover, well, sure, it's healthy for you, but you can also eat healthy in these ways, and that sort of muddies the water.
Yeah. It's like so weird, like some people who are like given the media that it's like, veganism is like wrong or like immoral or like just bad. It's just like crazy because it's just like food. You're still eating like just regular food, just
Yes.
without meat in it.
Yes.
It's
And
like,
neither you nor I are sitting here advocating for veganism only. But it's important not to muddy the science by saying, well, we're not really sure. No, we know
yeah, exactly.
plant-based diets are really good for our health and really good for the planet. It doesn't mean that we're all going to make that shift overnight, or that there aren't real cultural or financial reasons that people will continue to consume animal products. But the science is clear that it's good for us. And similar with food waste. We know it's a huge problem as far as being able to use the food that we have to feed the people who need to be fed, but also contributing further to carbon emissions because food is going to landfills and producing methane as it degrades or tries to degrade in landfills that are not made for that to turn into compost.
Right.
So that's sort of a brief history of climate science. But I also wanted to talk a little bit, because we have a little extra time,
Sure.
about some of the things that we've already seen come true from predictions that we saw in the past. When we take climate seriously, we can do great things. So I want you to think back to when you were a kid and people would talk about the hole in the ozone layer.
Yeah.
Do you remember this?
Yeah.
How was that presented to you as a kid?
It was kind of just like, yeah, there's this like big problem that affects the entire Earth, and it's causing like the glaciers to melt, and everybody's like, oh no, the polar bears.
Yeah. And I kind of do think that most people were on the same page about this.
Yeah.
And to really like push this for home, like it is because we all agreed internationally that it was a problem that we were going to solve.
Yeah.
And we fixed it.
So dope. That's the best.
In 1987, the United Nations collectively decided to adopt the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete ozone layer. And by 2008, it was the only UN agreement that was ratified in every country in the world.
That's so cool.
Amazing.
Amazing.
I mean, that is 31 years of time between the initiation of the protocol and everyone ratifying it, but no one has ever done it before. And we saw amazing outcomes because countries took responsibility for their ozone emissions and made sure to to push that back. So 99%, I said ozone emissions. I want to be clear that it was ozone depleting emissions.
Ozone depleting emissions, yeah.
About 99% of ozone depleting substances were phased out, and the ozone layer is replenishing. We fixed things.
Yeah.
We can do this with other elements of climate change. We have collective power if we listen to the recommendations of scientists. I also want to point out that when we say scientists, that can sound like a little vague. What's a scientist? Who are we really talking about? Can anyone be a scientist? Climate science is its own discipline, but there are also so many other disciplines that are relevant for climate science.
Yeah.
So when we talk about climate science, we're sometimes talking about chemists, physicists, biologists, marine biologists, arborists. All of those people are saying the same things. They may be approaching it from different perspectives. An arborist is thinking about the ways that trees and canopy are affected by climate change, and a marine biologist is thinking about sea turtles. But they're all saying the same things. Humans are causing climate change. Climate change is bad for this planet and the people and animals and other wildlife that live on it.
Period.
Lots of different ideas of how we change and where our priorities should lie. And we should be having those conversations. But we know that it's happening, and we have power to take some collective action. I also want to point out that most models for what will happen through climate change have been pretty accurate.
Yeah.
NASA actually did an analysis of various climate change models that have been put out for over 100 years, and those models have proven to be pretty true when we think about things like rising temperatures, ocean rise, weather patterns. Like, these models are pretty good, and we should be using them to make predictions and make adjustments to the ways that we live. And I just want to say that this doesn't even begin to cover the generations of knowledge that have been accumulated by Indigenous communities. So we've sat here and talked about scientific models. There are also communities that have lived in harmony with nature for generations and passed down knowledge. And we should absolutely be engaging with Indigenous communities too, to understand their unique knowledge around the places that they live and steward wildlife and the environment.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
No, that non-Western perspective is really great.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's my brief history of climate science and climate change. But I'm ready to hear a little bit more about some of the data that history has unraveled that you're going to share with us.
Absolutely. So the reason that we're here, it's all predicated on the fact that there is data that backs up what scientists are saying, that's telling us that there is an urgency, that there needs to be action to make sure that we can keep the Earth alive and thriving, or at some points, even just maintaining what we currently have for future generations. So I wanted to start off with one of my favorite statistics. It is from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, also just known as NOAA. It says that the 10 warmest years in the 143-year record have all occurred since 2010. The last 9 years, 2014 through 2022, ranked as the 9 warmest years on record. So, yeah, we see that the planet is at its warmest right now. We had an episode earlier where we said that we had the hottest day on record on the Earth in 2023.
Yes.
So, just to give us a little perspective, we know that the past 10 years have been warm, but we also know that climate change is trending warmer all the time. And so, to cite that, 99% of scientists agree with this, but NOAA also talks about the combined land and ocean temperature. It increased at an average rate of 0.14 degrees Fahrenheit per decade since 1880. So just talking about the Industrial Revolution that you were talking about, we've seen a consistent warming of 0.14 degrees Fahrenheit throughout every single decade. And starting in 1981, it's actually started warming twice as fast per decade. So if you could picture it, there's a little bit of a graph. Starting in 1880, we're seeing a little bit of an uptick in that warming, and then when you hit 1981, those ticks are getting even bigger. And that's not slowing down, it's only speeding up. In addition to just the warming of the planet, we're also seeing more drastic weather changes, right? It's not just global warming, like when I learned it was in high school. It's also climate change. Weather is changing. So to cite somebody very smart, your husband, the droughts are getting droughtier and the rains are getting rainier.
Shout out husband.
What I'm trying to say here, though, is in Ohio, we are seeing more increased frequency of heavy rainfalls. California is seeing even hotter and drier, longer droughts. The glaciers are melting. So we're seeing weather change in real time, like even over just the past couple decades. That's backed by the United States Environmental Protection Agency. The last 50 years have been generally wetter than average, they say. Specific trends vary by region, as the West has generally experienced more drought, while the Midwest and Northwest have become wetter.
I can tell you that my roof is not enjoying that. I had to. I'm getting flooding, and I just wanted to put this in like a perspective of what this means for like individual people.
Yeah.
Through the perspective of what it means for me,
Yeah.
which is that I'm probably gonna have to waterproof my basement, and it'll cost a lot, and my basement is finished, and it'll have to be unfinished to put that in because we're seeing leakage. And I don't want to blame all of that on climate change, but it is in the basement. And also my mudroom, I'm having leaking all over the place. But
I'm so sorry.
That's okay. You know, I'm happy to have a house that I get to take care of, but the rains have been torrential, and it makes it even harder for our systems to take that into account. My gutters can't handle it. My old roof is going to need to be replaced, and I might need to take some additional measures. So that's just a me thing of how it's affecting me. But you're right. You say Midwest getting wetter. Absolutely it is.
Yeah. This climate change affects people all the time, right? We've talked about it on the podcast. It affects our food systems. Olive oil is getting more expensive. It affects our homes, like you. It affects even our infrastructure. Like that water has to go somewhere. That water gets carried away by old infrastructure that is going to have to be replaced by our tax dollars. So that's money out of our pockets.
Absolutely. So I guess that's why I need you to come over and help me install a rain barrel. That'll be one of my steps.
Disconnecting your downspouts, one of the best things you can do for basement flooding. But also, just aside from warming and weather, we've talked about the planet warming. We've talked about weather changing. We've also seen wildlife drop drastically. The World Wildlife Fund has a 2020 report, Living Planet report. It had some alarming news. The world has seen an average drop of 68% of mammal populations, bird populations, reptile and amphibian populations since 1970. So just in the past 50 years or so, we've seen 68% of our biodiversity start dropping off.
And I love critters.
Yeah, critters are so cool, right?
I know.
So this is affecting the Earth. It's affecting Mother Earth. And while I believe Mother Earth will probably work its way through catastrophe like it has in the past with dinosaurs, I don't know if we're going to make it through. That's something that we got to be cognizant of.
Yeah, and just because you'll recover if I kick you doesn't mean that I should be able to kick you.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great way to put it, Shelby.
Thank you. I just came up with that on the spot.
Scientists are taking their measurements and saying, these are the trends that we're seeing. We're not just thinking with emotions, although we do love to love on critters and we want to see the beauty in nature. We're not just tree huggers that are citing our own emotions. We're citing science. And speaking of which, one of these big misnomers that goes into climate change is that, climate change has been happening for thousands of years. This is nothing new. Well, that's also misinformation. As we talked about earlier, NOAA came out with a climate change report talking about how the increase of climate change induced by man started with the Industrial Revolution. Mm-hmm. In 1880, we've been warming consistently ever since, and that hasn't slowed either. This didn't just come out of nowhere. We know that it's introduced by humans.
Yes. There is a difference between natural patterns of the Earth and human-induced climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. And to actually hit this point home even further, ExxonMobil actually did its own study in 1970, and they found some really alarming results. They were basically by 2050, the Earth is going to be in really bad shape because of the fossil fuel industry, basically. That's ExxonMobil, the oil and gas company.
Oh, yeah.
With their own study. And NPR reported on this, some investigative journalism through, and they actually were after this study came out from ExxonMobil launched their own campaign, successful campaign, just casting doubt on their own report. Because if we use less oil and gas, that cuts into their profit margins, right? Mm-hmm. So that's wild. Even their own companies are saying this is not good for us.
Oh yeah, some of the brightest minds are working in industries like oil and gas because there's innovation and money to be made. I get it. But yeah, great scientists put together research, showed that it was bad for the world, and then said, how do we bury this?
Yeah.
How do we bury these findings?
Exactly. It's so wild. So while this is all really heavy stuff, existential stuff, there is hope. You've mentioned the ozone layer. If we take collective action and we could take responsibility, we can overcome things like climate change. We can save what we have.
Well, I want to say thank you to you for taking a step back and talking about the history and science behind what we've been jabbering on about for 30 whole episodes. Thanks for 30 episodes, co-host.
Yeah, this has been fun, Shelby. Nice job.
Why don't you let people know how they can stay connected to us for the next 30?
Absolutely. The next 100. If you'd like to stay connected to us, be sure to follow us on Instagram and TikTok at One Planet Media. That's ONE1. And if you'd like to rewatch full episodes, check out our YouTube channel, All Things Green Show. You can find all of our sources from today's episode in our show notes.
We'll be back at the same time next week. Thank you for being a part of the global sustainability movement.